Hello YouTube, in this video I'm going to teach you how to implement variations and rotations in your gentleman split. But in reality, it doesn't matter whether or not you're following that type of program or template, because it's going to work for pretty much any type of program out there. Since the rules that follow the application of these principles tend to be the same with a few differences. So first off, when we're talking about variations or rotations, what we're talking about is modification of movement patterns that are going to be scheduled differently to allow for progression. That is the gist of it. This is why they're used. And for the most part, you're going to find that there is a little bit of an oversimplification of those concepts, because I'm sure that you've heard the terms variations and accessories a ton of time, but you rarely are able to know exactly what the person mean by them. And therefore, for me, I want to make it very clear. There's nothing magical about these terms, and they represent very simple concepts. For the most part, it's going to be picking lifts that are going to be aligned in terms of specificity to replace other lifts. And the way the replacement works can be twofold. It can be a variation or a rotation, but a variation can be used as a rotation. So that's the second thing that really defines those terms. A variation already implies that there is a main lift. Because if it's a variation, it has to vary from something. And what does it vary from? Well, it varies from your main style. Your main style of what? Of movement pattern, okay? So if you have made a program and you haven't thought about the tree of specificity and the lift selection, you can't really speak about variations, because you need to understand how the body moves and how the muscles are being recruited to be able to have variations. The discussion around variation, for the most part, surrounds the idea that the more you advance in your lifting career, the more variations you're going to need. Because it's implied that at some point, you're going to have a tough time progressing with only one style, and you're going to have to need to implement different ways to do the movement. That is true to me, I agree with that 100%. But I don't agree with the idea that novices shouldn't do variations, because for me, there is no point in having the novice repeat the same movement, the exact same movement, 3 times a week. They can do variations, but the variation needs to be extremely close in specificity. And I have found that the more advanced you are, the more you know what you want out of those movements, the more you can actually try and be more exotic with the variations, maybe because you want a certain muscle group to be hit more, or maybe because you have decided that it's a good choice for your program. So that's going to be the variation. By itself, a variation can be any lift, meaning that a back squat can be a variation if your main style is something different. This is a little bit iffy, because I have always found that it's much easier to think of variations as a down list, meaning that you have a king, you have a main lift, and then you have a list of variations, lifts that are going to feed the main lift. All right, but that's only if you think about this in what I would call a powerlifting centric mindset and mentality. It's one that I have because I found that for my programming needs for bodybuilding, it works. I understand if it's not the case for you. If your main squat style is the Zercher squat, it is perfectly fine to call a back squat a variation. But understand that the reason why, for the most part, no one calls the back squat a variation is because it doesn't really do a good job at being a variation. It does a tremendous job at being a main lift. And that's also the reason why you see a clear distinction between main lifts and variations. Yeah, technically, both of these lifts on those 2 different lists could intermingle and replace one another, but they are put in these categories for a reason. So that's how you're going to think about your variations. And a variation to me is like a joker. You do not want to use one if you don't have to, or if you don't have a good reason. It could be to progress, yes. It could also be to work on your technique. If you want to add post squats, even if your back squat is still raising just fine, that's okay. If you're telling yourself, hey, it's because I want to work on my technique at the bottom of the squat. That is an excellent reason. You don't need to be afraid to implement other lifts. Just because you're not repeating the same thing again and again is not a problem at all, as long as the neurological adaptation takes place and you're doing a similar movement pattern. And for the gentleman split and the way the gentleman split is programmed, It is key because when you look at the template and the skeleton of the program, you realize that it's based around lifts because it's based around an upper-lower template that is free, meaning that you don't have to respect it strictly, and therefore it's lift-centric. You build the program around lifts. And I'm going to say also right off the bat that to me and for me, any good program is based around lifts, meaning that you're going to start thinking about the volume, the intensity, and the frequency after you've selected the lifts and not before. You cannot say, okay, I want to do a 5x5 here on Monday, let me pick the lift. No, that's reverse engineering. It doesn't work like that. So your variations are going to start coming into play to be able to feed the main lifts that usually take place at the start of the day because they represent the strength work. That's already something that needs to be taken into account. You are scarcely going to do a variation as the main lift. Why? Because progression on the variation is not the key aspect of it. The variation's goal is to accumulate tonnage. And therefore, you will find that you will always be slower on strength progression on your variations. If you're not, there might be a problem with the program. So that's for the number one key aspect of what can be used as a replacement in the program. You're doing a lift and you want to do it with a different style because you're afraid of obvious injuries or you want just to vary the style, do a variation, add a variation. There's always going to be a cap and a hard limit on variations, of course, because as I said, they're jokers. You don't want to overutilize them. You don't want to be too overindulgent. There's very little cases where having 4 different variations of the back squat, for example, is going to be necessary. But you can have variations that fit both the back squat, for example, and another lift. A good example is the good morning. The good morning could be considered as a variation for the back squat and the deadlift, the knee flexion and the hip hinge. So it's one variation that feeds 2 styles. And you come to understand when I say that it means that every single lift is connected in the program. So in reality, a variation feeds 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 other lifts. By itself, it's being fed by other lifts, which by themselves are being fed by other lifts. This is the interconnectivity and the synergistic aspect of programming that to me is so important and a little bit too ignored in bodybuilding. After that, let's talk about rotations. Rotations to me are a bit more advanced because they are going to require of you a stronger understanding of scheduling because they take place on the frequency plane, but they affect the volume and intensity planes. Whereas the variation is much more clear-cut because the variation is a replacement, but for the most part, it's not going to take the spot of anything else. It's going to create its own spot. So it's much easier to manage and to decide where it's supposed to take place. The rotation means that there is going to be from 2 to upwards of, I don't know how many you want, rotations. So there's going to be 2 lifts that are supposed to happen at the same day, but they won't because on one week you'll have one lift and on the second week you'll have the second lift. This entails that if you want it to make sense, you need to have those lifts represent the same movement pattern or similar style of movement pattern, meaning that if you have a rotation on Monday for your second exercise and it's a hip hinge on the first case, it better be a hip hinge on the second case. The reason why is very simple to understand. That's 2, right? That rotation represents the number 2. If you did not match, right, and there are different styles, now it's number 4. Why? Because I'm expecting that somewhere else in the program, I'm going to be able to find a similar movement pattern for both A and B. So 1 and 2 became 3 and 4 because they have to match somewhere else. If they don't match, it's not the end of the wood. You can have rotations that are not in the same plane. They are not the same movement pattern, but it sort of defeats the idea of a rotation because, and that's when it starts really getting complicated. If you're telling me that you're letting that 1, 2 happen without them matching, in reality, it's not 4, it's 8. And maybe I'm losing some of you guys. Let me explain why. If these rotate and are not the same movement pattern, and it's happening on week A and week B, this means that you are neglecting to train a movement pattern that should have been represented on week B when they rotate with week A. And likewise with week 1. because lift B was not represented because they're different. All right? So that means that there needs to be in the program on a different day, on that day, a rotation or just a set that exists somewhere that makes up for it. So that's 4. And now keep in mind that if those 2 that you also presented fail to do that, that's 8. Because now you have rotations that don't match. And this is why I encourage you not to do that. If you didn't understand what I just say, just stay in the line of specificity. Don't even try. It's possible, I know people who have made programs for themselves or they have desynergistic rotations, but it complicates the heck out of the program. It can be excellent for overuse injury prevention and for volume and intensity manipulation if you know how to manage it. Most people don't know. So just stay in line, okay? If you have a rotation in the program, have it be on week A of back squat, on week B of front squat. Keep it simple at first. You can start experimenting with the more advanced principles of programming afterwards. And the idea of the rotation is twofold. First off, just like with a variation in reality, it is going to allow you to not fall into the trap of repeating the same movement over and over again. It's going to prevent overuse injury. And on top of that, the second aspect that is good that the variation doesn't really cover is it creates freshness and flexibility in the program because, and now we're getting into something that is more advanced, but not as advanced as desynergistic variations and rotations, sorry. The rotation can also take place via self-regulation, autoregulation. And autoregulation, again, is a fancy term in programming. It's very easy to understand. Autoregulation means that there's no such thing as something set on paper. You decide when something happens. But for autoregulation to work, you need to be able to have in the program mechanisms put in place. And the explanation is very simple. It's the difference between having to turn on the light and having to craft a light bulb and an entire mechanical system on the spot, or just having a flick ready, right? It's so much easier to come into the room and do this, up, the light is on. That's easier. That's what I talk about when I say a mechanism in the program. And one of such mechanisms can be rotations, because the rotation can of course be scheduled, and it's like a revolving automatic system that tells you week A you do this lift, week B you do this lift, week A you do this lift, etc., etc. But you can also have a rotation that is going to be decided by your own will, meaning that you come in and on that day you have 3 choices, A, B, C, and you decide. That of course is risky, because if you're the type of person who has a tough time auto-regulating, it's not going to be good, and you're going to maybe potentially have lacks of tonnages. You're going to not be up to date on your specific work, etc., etc. So it's a little bit more advanced, but it's something that I like, and it's something that I do, because in my program, if you look at my days, my entire day for the most part takes 4 to 5 hours, right? And I would of course never train that long because I'm just not at that level yet. It's not needed. I most likely will never get to that level, for the simple reason that once you get to a certain number of sets or reps, you can always push the intensity, and the programming and the progression of the tonnage will not take place with the accumulation of sets anymore. That's a concept that I might discuss if I can find the right spot in the hypertrophy series for it. But there is such a thing as a program that cannot be lengthier, because it contains so much complexity in itself that it allows for progression without having to accumulate more volume. The tonnage can always progress. But in this case with the rotation, what I personally do is I come in and I give myself 4 or 5 choices of sets. And for the most part, they're supersets. And on each day I decide, okay, for this week I need to do this, keeping in mind what I did last week and what I'm going to do next week. So that's something that takes a lot of awareness. And of course, the more days you have in the program, the more awareness it takes. Because if you have a 6 days gentleman split with rotations every day that have 3 choices, you do the math. That's 3 times 6. And if I'm not mistaken, that's 18. That's 18 choices plus 18 choices for the week prior, plus 18 choices for the next week. That's too many choices. And therefore, this is really advanced. For the most part, I would really encourage you to keep rotations to a very simple A or B, all right? 2 choices. And then you slowly add them in your program here and there when it makes sense. When it comes to where you can place rotations, I don't recommend you start placing them as strength work. Because strength work, if anything, needs to be regular when you just get started, especially with gentleman splits. Because even though sets do not wield the most amount of tonnage, they still represent a lot of progression aspects. And therefore, if you mess them up with rotations, you could suffer from it. That being said, it can be implemented, absolutely. It can be implemented at any point of the program. Because unlike variations where I told you that if you apply variations, you should still have in mind that you have a main goal and a main style that needs to be still practiced and not replaced. It's not the same for rotations. Rotations can really be for what opens the workout, what closes the workout, the sets that follow the strength work, etc., etc. It really is the window of freedom that you open at some point when you're comfortable with programming. But to me, before you start even considering rotations, you need to get very comfortable with your variation work. And I want to make sure that I put it into your head, even if you don't do a gentleman split, or if you do a gentleman split, when you first get started, you keep it simple, okay? Because simple works. Simple will get you into the game. And then you experiment here and there. You don't want to be the guy that has a massively complex program when there are just 6 months in. There's no point in doing that. You're going to just complexify a process that doesn't need to be complex. Get the gains you can get from minimalistic programming and then complexify. Minimalism is a problem when it stops your progression. If you're minimalist and it works and you have an amazing physique, doesn't matter. But that's a topic for a later video. That's a topic for my video on minimalism, where I'm going to finally explain what that means. Because people ask me, okay, you say minimalism is bad, but then you're minimalist in some of your programs, how come? Well, it's simple. The concept in itself isn't bad or good. It's bad or good depending on how you apply it. And therefore, I'm going to make a full segment on that to explain to you exactly what it means to be minimalistic when you program, when it's bad, when it's good. But for now, I'm going to leave you with that. So that's how you implement rotations and variations and gentleman splits, and in reality, any type of program. And I'm going to leave you with maybe what you expected from this video, which is a practical example. And you're going to see that all what I just said really boils down to very simple principles. For example, we're going to take the example of back squats again. You do back squats and you think, my progression is slowing down, but I feel burnt out. I don't want to squat more each week. What could I do? Well, you could do variations instead. Therefore, you have two choices. Either you replace one occurrence of the back squat by a variation, or you add a variation, meaning that you decide that you keep the same amount of back squats, but on a certain day you're going to do another knee flexion that fits the back squat. The reason why I said we don't want variations to replace the back squat is because we don't want it to replace every single occurrence of it. It doesn't mean that you can't replace one occurrence by a variation. For example, a pause squat. So instead of doing squat on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you could be doing on Monday and Friday, and on Wednesday you do pause squats. And then there's also the idea of, and the very advantageous position of, the location of the variation within the program. Because if your back squat has to open the program, the variation of it doesn't. You can if you want to, but it doesn't have. So maybe what you could do is on Wednesday, hey, you open with a heavy pull and then you do back squats. Is it going to be good for your lower back? All of these things you have to keep in mind. But that's a variation, it's very simple. So it's either a replacement or it's an addition. For the rotation, same example as the back squat, you're a little bit more advanced and you think, I would like to get a taste of a different type of squat, but where do I put it? I don't really want to squat more often. Well, very simple. Look at your pause squat. You already practice the back squat 3 times a week. Do you really need to, on top of that, always do pause squats? No. So you do rotation instead. And what do you want to train instead of the pause squat? Maybe Zercher squat. Cool. Okay. Rotation. And you implement it as a very simple A and B. Week A, you do back squat, pause squat, back squat. Week B, you do back squat, Zercher squat, back squat. Simple. As you can tell, the start was a little bit more complex because I explained the concepts. When you apply the concepts on paper, it goes like this. Of course, as I said, there is more to what I just said, meaning that this is just the beginning. right? This is just getting started. You can really dig deeper and you can make some amazing programs, but at the start you don't need to and you shouldn't. Stay simple, stay focused, and expand from there. I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.